Sources telling CNBC that American trade negotiations will be heading to China either late this week or sometime next week for face-to-face talks, though a final trade deal could still be months away. Joining us right now is the U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, and we're thrilled to have him here. Good morning to you. We want to get your take right now. We want to start out on sort of what is going to happen in this next week and exactly what you think the timeline looks like.
Well, good morning. It's great to be here with you. The timeline on the budget or the timeline on China?
I want to go to China first, given that markets this morning, both in China and the U.S., seem to be moving on this expectation that there's going to be a team, including Lighthizer and potentially yourself, headed there.
Right. So Ambassador Lighthizer and I will depart on Monday. We will spend Tuesday and Wednesday in Shanghai. The reason why we're going to Shanghai is that the host country, China, has invited us there. There's a significance to them of the Shanghai communique and the symbolism, obviously, of that important agreement. So hopefully I'll take that as good news that we'll be making progress next week. But I would say there's a lot of issues. So my expectation is that this will be followed up with a meeting back in D.C. after this, and hopefully we'll continue to progress.
Mr. Secretary, can you explain sort of where the White House is with Huawei at this point? Because that seems to be such a pivotal chess piece in these conversations. There are U.S. companies that clearly want to do business with Huawei. Huawei yesterday just announced that they're laying off 600 people in the United States, and wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I think, as you know, the president hosted a group of tech CEOs in the Oval Office. He also had Secretary Ross, myself, Ambassador Lighthizer, Director Kudlow. We had a very good discussion. Part of the discussion was obviously on Huawei. Part of the discussion actually was on other important technology issues and immigration issues. But the Huawei issue is being driven out of Commerce, and what Commerce has said is that they will issue waivers for items that don't impact national security. So where there are commodity products or issues that don't impact national security, Commerce will be proceeding with that. And I think it was a very productive two-way discussion for the president.
Related to that, and I think this has to do with national security, but also corporations being patriotic. You probably saw the comments late last week from Peter Thiel saying that he thought that Google, that Alphabet was treasonous. And then President Trump said that he was going to look in to those comments. There's some people in both Chinese officials and Chinese executives who at least have said to me, how is that any different than what Huawei is relative to the U.S., to the Chinese government in terms of that relationship?
Well, let me just say the president did look into that, as well as I. The CEO of Google was with us this week. We both had very direct discussions. They assured us that there is very, very limited work. The only work that they're doing is some very minimal open source work. They continue to do work with us in certain areas of DoD. And I think, Google is an American company that wants to help out the U.S.
So Peter Thiel's comments were misguided?
I don't see any area. Again, the president and I did diligence on this issue, and we're not aware of any areas where Google is working with the Chinese government in a way that in any way raises concerns.
Okay. Let's pivot real quick to the debt ceiling and the debt deal. I want to read you a comment. This is from FreedomWorks about this deal that has all been struck. It says, Washington has all but abandoned economic sanity. With this deal, GOP leadership has ceded its ground on fiscal responsibility, for which for years was supposed to be the core tenet of the party. What do you make of that critique?
Well, first thing I'd say is that spending is an issue that has to be a bipartisan agreement. So this can't be an issue of just what the president wants to do, what the Republicans want to do, or what the Democrats wanted to do. It wasn't just because of the debt ceiling. I mean, we're very happy we got a 2.5-year extension to the debt ceiling, including our special powers. But any spending required bipartisan agreement. So the first issue is the president was very determined to fund the military and make sure that we funded veterans. So we held expenses to a modest 2% increase a year, which is in line with inflation. So I think we were very careful on the spending issues. We think we'll grow revenues in excess of 4% over this period of time a year. And, this had to be a bipartisan agreement. So people who said we should have increased military and decreased non-military, one, we had to take care of our vets, and two, we needed bipartisan support. There's a cost of losing the House.
Mr. Secretary, can we just go back to what you were talking about with Google and both you and the president kind of looking into those claims? We had Ash Carter on the show last week, the former defense secretary, and he had said when we asked him about those same questions about whether Google was cooperating with the Chinese government in ways that could be considered treasonous, he kind of demurred from that, but then focused on the idea that he's been disappointed with some of the companies in Silicon Valley, the idea that they have not wanted to do work for the Defense Department, the idea that they've kind of caved to some of their employees with those feelings. He seems to be of the belief that if you're an American company, you have benefited from the government and what this country has done for you, and you should be willing to do work for the government in turn. Do you share those thoughts?
Well, I do share those thoughts, but, I'd also balance that, and I want to be careful because a lot of companies cooperate with the Defense Department, some of our most important critical technology companies. And as I just mentioned in my conversations with Google, and we researched this, there are areas they are cooperating. Having said that, private businesses do have the right to make decisions. They're owned by shareholders. They have boards that control them. But I do think it's important, and I would say almost all the leading technology companies in the U.S. Do cooperate with the government in very significant ways.
Mr. Secretary, related to technology, the Department of Justice said yesterday that they're going to look into some of the big tech companies that were at the White House yesterday, in fact, and consider the antitrust issues that are involved. What's your take right now? Do you believe that these big companies, and I'm thinking of the Facebooks and the Googles and the Apples and the Amazons of the world, do you believe that they're hurting competition?
Well, let me just say I think it's very good that the Attorney General is going to look into this. I think it's an important issue, and I look forward to him reporting back to the president and hearing his recommendations. I think, as you know, if you look at Amazon, although there are certain benefits to it, they've destroyed the retail industry across the United States. So there's no question they've limited competition. There's areas where they've really hurt small businesses. So I don't think this is a one-size-fits-all, and I don't have an opinion going in other than I think it's absolutely right that the Attorney General is looking into these issues, and I look forward to listening to his recommendations to the president.
Is Amazon's competition any different than what Walmart used to be a decade ago?
It is different. In a way, it's the same, and in a way, it's different. I mean, people had those concerns about Walmart. I think, as you see, Walmart developed a business where small businesses could continue to compete with them. And look, Walmart ceded a lot of the retail business to Amazon. So these are important issues that I look forward to hearing from the Attorney General.
How do you weigh the size and scale issue of some of the big U.S. companies versus when you think about how we compete internationally? One of the things you hear out of Silicon Valley from Silicon Valley executives is say, look, we're trying to compete aggressively with China, which you're going to negotiate with as well on trade. And if we become smaller or we become hemmed in and have to limit ourselves, it's actually going to become harder to compete.
Well, I think that's a very important statement, and that's why I think there's not a one-size-that-fits-all approach. So people talk about the FANG stocks like they're all the same. Each company is very different. Apple competes head-to-head with Huawei, with Samsung, with other companies. So I think there's no question the size and scale of Apple is very important. They also have an ecosystem. So, I don't think you can talk about competition amongst all these companies in the same way.
Mr. Treasury Secretary, the president has overtly actually talked about a weaker dollar being in our best interest in terms of on moves by Jay Powell and the Fed, and how he feels like we're not on a level playing field with the rest of the world in terms of central banks and accommodation. In the past, we've never had a Treasury Secretary do anything other than say we have a strong dollar policy and we advocate a strong dollar policy. So you could be the first one in history to say we have a weak dollar policy. Is that in your view something that would benefit the United States if we could weaken the dollar for exports?
Well, let me just comment that although Treasury secretaries have always said that they believe in a strong dollar, Treasury secretaries have also been particularly careful about commenting on the dollar. And, I remember last year,
we did that to you in Davos. I know.
At Davos,
I thought you forgot.
My limited comments got misinterpreted, all over the place. So, let me just clarify this. I think the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. It's in our interest. We want to maintain it. A stable dollar is very important. And over the long-term period of time, again, the long term, I do believe in a strong dollar, which signifies a strong U.S. economy, a strong stock market, and particularly because of the president's economic policies. We have growth in the U.S. that has outpaced everywhere else. We have a ton of money as a result of tax cuts, regulatory relief coming into the U.S. So just as the stock market has gone up as a result of these policies, there's also these markets are the largest traded markets in the world. So, what I would say is the dollar trades as much as anything in the world every day, and there's buyers and sellers. And right now there's a lot of people who want to invest in the U.S., and that creates a lot of demand for dollars.
Wow. It's a really nuanced answer that you get. So you don't advocate a weak dollar policy near term, per se?
I am not going to advocate a weak dollar policy near term
although
as
the
Treasury
president,
Secretary.
Although the president seems to be in some respects.
I think the president is very focused on a lot of issues. He is focused on our trade issues. He is focused on our economic issues. I think you know where he is on the Federal Reserve. I don't need to make any comments on that. But the president is very pleased with the economic performance. And, the next election is really going to be an election about two different views. Our view is about growth, growing revenues faster than expenses, having free markets, making sure the U.S. economy grows, creating job opportunities. And the other view is very different. So if you have concerns about, our budget deal, you can imagine what a Democrat-controlled White House would look like
it's hard to
in
tell
terms
the difference,
of tax
though.
and spend.
That's
not fair at all.
The Democrats were definitely celebrating the deal that was right. In the second, if there is a second term, we've heard the rumor that maybe spending cuts are going to be something that the administration would focus on. Are you still going to be here for the next?
I'm definitely going to be here with the president for the second term, and the president is determined on a bipartisan basis. We look at expense controls. So whether it's something like Reagan did, we're going to look at, again, we want to spend money on the military, but we want to make sure we do it efficiently. So we'll want to look at how we spend in the military. And, as I said, our job is cut taxes, grow revenues faster than expenses, grow the economy, and that's what the president is doing.
Secretary Mnuchin, I know it's difficult. We keep asking you to explain the president's thought process with some of these things. Maybe you can, maybe you can't on this issue. But if he's convinced this is such a great economy, why does he also want the Fed to cut rates?
Well, again, I want to be careful because these are the president's views, because, as Treasury Secretary, I'm not going to comment on interest rates.
Right.
But the president believes that we have very low inflation. So I think he believes that when the Fed raised rates, they had much higher inflation expectations. And because we've had very low inflation, that we should cut rates so that they're more in line with the rest of the world. And, again, when you look at interest rates in the United States, everybody will agree. You have to look at real interest rates. So, the Fed has models. We have models. Sometimes these models turn out to be right. Sometimes they turn out to be wrong. And, again, without me commenting on what the Fed is going to do, obviously the market expects the Fed to cut. So if they do that, I think you're going to see a continued improvement in the economy throughout the year.
Mr. Secretary, two other quick questions. Boeing announced their earnings this morning. There's still questions about when that 737 MAX plane is going to get in the air. How concerned are you about the international reaction to Boeing right now?
Well, Boeing's a great American company, and they have a big Defense Department business. They have a big commercial business. There's no question. This is very important to us. We compete Boeing versus Airbus every day. I think, as you know, the president has said he's concerned about the 737 MAX. Quite frankly, he thinks they should bring back the 757 and look at selling 757s. We want to absolutely make sure that before the 737 MAX flies, that it's safe. But I think there's no question Boeing has the financial capacity to fix this. But I think we need to make sure they're fixed, and we need to figure out how they continue to compete against Airbus, because they are a leading U.S. company.
Secretary, would the fiscal restraint in the second term include entitlements, which the president never talks about, I don't think, in terms of the unfunded liabilities, which some people think, I don't know, I hear 80 trillion, 100 trillion, something eventually. It's not a great subject to talk about in an election. I understand that, Medicare, things like that. But would that ever be on the president's plate in the second, or would you put it there? Do you worry about entitlement, not being able to deliver on all these promises?
Well, I've not spoken to the president about this issue. We're really focused on the economic issues today. So this is just my own personal thoughts. In no way do I want to attribute them to the president.
You keep saying that a lot.
I think we need to make sure that we guarantee people who we had promises that we keep those promises. So that's very important. But we have a $4 trillion expenses, discretionary, just part of it. There's many things in the non-discretionary part of these budgets that we can look at without in any way breaking promises to the people who rely on these, our seniors, our veterans, and in other areas. And again, this will need to be looked at on a bipartisan basis. Hopefully we'll take back the House, but even with the House, you need bipartisan support in the Senate to get these things done with 60 votes.
And Mr. Secretary, we could not leave this interview without asking you at least a question about crypto. The last time we had you on, I think Joe tried to convince you about the merits of Bitcoin. You talked about regulating and the need to regulate Libra. And the question I ultimately sort of land with is, do you think that all cryptocurrencies will ultimately have to be regulated like like a commodity or like a currency, meaning that especially digital currencies like a Bitcoin that don't actually have a central organizer will have to have the same kinds of regulations, and how that would happen?
Well, all cryptocurrencies today in the United States are subject to regulation. They're subject to the Bank Secrecy Act, they're subject to our money laundering, and they're subject to the same issues that physical. So whether you're MoneyGram, whether you're Western Union, or whether you're trading Bitcoin, you are subject to that. And I can tell you there was 100% agreement from the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors. Those rules we will enforce throughout the world. So we will make sure that cryptocurrencies are not used for bad activities. I think, as I've said in the past, I am concerned that Bitcoin is used for a lot of illicit activities. We have a working group to combat that. And I'm also concerned that consumers don't understand the speculative issue of these things. And as it relates to Libra, we've been made very clear to Facebook before they start this. This needs to be something that passes our regulations. And again, there was 100% support at the G7 on these issues. Right. So we support, we like payment systems that reduce costs, but we don't support unregulated bad actors using anything, any type of currency or cryptocurrency.
When you talk about the working group looking at Bitcoin, what specifically are you looking at, and what do you think the options are in terms of things you could do?
Well, we're looking at all of the crypto assets. I mean, we talk about Bitcoin just because it's the largest, but it has to be a level playing field. And this is a working group that includes all the regulators, the Fed, the OCC, the Consumer Protection Bureau, the SEC, the CFTC. So we'll look at it, whether you're trading a derivative, whether you're trading cash, whether you're looking at it in a payment system. We're going to make sure we have a unified approach. And my guess is that there are going to be more regulations that come out from all these agencies to make sure that we keep the U.S. financial system safe.
You think we'll be talking about Bitcoin in 10 years from now?
I won't be talking about Bitcoin in 10 years. I can assure you that.
But you might be in at least 6 years. As Treasury Secretary, as you just said.
Exactly. I would bet even in 5 or 6 years, I'm no longer talking about Bitcoin as Treasury Secretary. I'll have other priorities.
You'll be loaded up on Bitcoin and a gazillionaire.
I can assure you I will personally not be loaded up on Bitcoin.
Okay.
Never say never.
It sounds like the Secretary is not convinced about Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us this morning. We hope to see you very soon.